Today we're going to continue our history curriculum. Right before break, we read the story of Benjamin West. I know a lot of you loved that story. It was one of my favorites as well. The story of a young boy who had the gift of being an artist, but for a good part of his life, the people around him did not accept that gift that he was given. But of course, as we learned, God changed the hearts of his family and his community, and he grew up to be known as the father of American art. Benjamin West painted the portrait of the man that we're going to start reading about today, and that, as you can see, is George Washington. So I wish you were sitting on the carpet with me like we do at school, and I could ask you questions and see your faces, but I'm just going to pretend that you're here with me. So I want you to just get comfortable, maybe grab a blanket, and enjoy the story. George Washington. This was written by the D'Ailairs, the same people who wrote Leif the Lucky and Pocahontas and some of the other stories that we've read. Virginia was once a wilderness. Wild beasts lived there, and swift Indians ran through grass and swamps. In the fall, the Indians went to the shore and pitched their camps on the bluff where Pope's Creek falls into the great Potomac River. Here they fished and caught oysters and threw the empty shells around their wigwams. The shells piled up and up until at last the top of the bluff became an oyster shell hill. Then across the sea came the men from England and chased the Indians away. The Englishmen settled on the land, and their king ruled over Virginia. One of these men from England was John Washington. He chose the land around the oyster shell hill, where he built a home for his family. He cleared much wilderness and made a big farm. And here on Wakefield Farm, more than 200 years ago, his grandson's son, George Washington, was born. He was born in a little red brick house that his father had built on Oyster Shell Hill. By that time, so much land had been cleared that the wilderness was far in the distance, hidden in the blue haze. Horses and cows had their pasture where wild beasts had lived, and slaves worked on the Indian hunting grounds. For the hunting grounds had become great fields of grain and tobacco. George heard about the Indians from his father when they walked around together, looking after the farm, which was now so big that they called it a plantation. And he learned that all the family were both fed and dressed by the crops that grew in the fields. Of course, here's George's dad. Here's little George as they're walking around learning about the plantation. The tobacco leaves were sent on ships to England. There they were exchanged for beautiful clothing, like the suit he wore himself, and for other fine things they did not yet know how to make in Virginia. The hummingbird shot through the air, the wild turkey clucked to her chicks, and little George dug and planted in a corner of his mother's garden. He had only himself to play with, for his sister Betty was still a baby, and the children on the next plantation lived very far away. It was much too far to walk, and he was still too small to ride a pony. As soon as his feet could reach the stirrups, his father gave him a pony, and he began to learn to ride. At first the pony jumped and shook itself, but George hung onto the mane and did not show that he was afraid. So it was not long before he could sit firmly in the saddle and hold the bridle right. Then he and the pony were friends, and he rode with his mother and father to visit the neighboring plantations. By this time, too, the Washington family had left the Oyster Shell Hill. They were living at Mount Vernon. another plantation his father owned higher up on the Great Potomac River. And George now had some little brothers to play with and look after. In the evening, his mother called the children together, and they all sat quietly around the fireplace in the living room. She told them stories from the Holy Bible, and on the shiny tiles of the fireplace there were painted pictures of the stories she told. Thus George learned his Bible, and he learned to be good and honest. When George Washington was old enough to go to school, his father decided to move from Mount Vernon to another plantation he had bought. In a big carriage, the whole family drove through deep forests. Tall trees shut out the light, and from behind the trunks, birds and beasts peered curiously at the travelers. But George did not see any Indians, for the Indians lived still deeper in the wilderness. Even so, he had many adventures on his journey, for the roads were bad, and it was difficult to travel in those days. Every now and then, the wheel stuck in a mud hole, or a rotten tree fell straight across the road. Then the horses jumped over the tree and quite forgot that the carriage could not jump too. But the Washingtons reached Ferry Farm on the Rappahannock River safely. That was their new home. We're going to stop there for today. Kind of reminds me of the story of the courage of Sarah Noble. Remember, as she and her dad journeyed through the forest to find their new home. It was a little bit different with Sarah and her dad, though, because they only had a horse. George Washington and his family had a carriage and had probably a little bit easier time than Sarah Noble. Well, tomorrow or next time we'll pick up and continue the story. But what you're going to do is look behind the tab in your binder for Monday, and you should have the picture of George Washington's mother as she speaks to her children about the Word of God in the evening. So you're going to color that picture. I'm sure some of you are looking forward to putting more pictures in your history notebook. So you can start working on that today, and then we'll put that in your notebook and write a sentence that I have in your assignments. So we'll continue the story next time.